Welcome back. In today's class, we're going to focus on Mesoamerica, southern Mexico, and what's today Central America, and look particularly at the ancient Mayan civilization. As you may recall from your junior high school or high school studies of world cultures in what's now Mexico, Central America, and South America, there were many, many hundreds, if not thousands, of ancient societies. But the three major ones were the Aztecs, shown in the northern section here in central Mexico, the Incas along the western coast of South America, and the Mayas, the subject of today's discussion. Both the Aztec and Inca civilizations were flourishing when the Spanish conquistadores arrived following Christopher Columbus's arrival in the Western Hemisphere in 1492. And within a number of years, both the Aztec and Inca empires were destroyed. And as you've probably learned before, a major factor in the destruction of those empires and many other indigenous groups, including in what's now the United States, was because of the transmission of European diseases for which the indigenous people in the Western Hemisphere had no acquired immunities. Now we're going to focus today again on the Mayas and their civilization, their culture. While it still survives today, the main culture had died out well before the Spanish arrived. This is a close-up here of Mexico and part of Central America. And the region that is outlined in red was the extent of the Mayan world. And we can see at the southern part of the Mayan area, it was mountainous. And then going north from those mountains, you can see in the center there, Tikal, Tikal, one of their great ceremonial centers, Calakmul. And then moving up, it moves into what's known now as the Yucatan Peninsula of Mexico. And near the northern part of that is the famous ruin of Chichen Itza, which we'll see in a moment. And just to the right of that, to the east of that, we have the major resort city of Cancun, and the small island offshore there is Cozumel. So if you haven't been to any of these ruins, and if you go to Cancun or that area for a vacation, and as you know, you can buy fairly inexpensive packages from Houston to get there, you can go on a trip from your hotel front door on a bus and see some of these major ruins, such as Chichen Itza, Coba, or Tulum up there in the northern part. And that makes a nice day trip to round out your vacation. Now, the Mayan Empire, the peak was from the Mayas independently developed a mathematical system with a base of 20. Of course, our mathematical system has a base of 10. But of greater importance, they developed the concept of a zero and place value for numbers. And we've already seen that the Arabs in the Islamic culture had developed zero mathematically well before Western Europe. The Mayans had a writing system that used glyphs or symbols. Many people refer to them as hieroglyphics because they look a bit like ancient Egyptian. Until about 90 or 100 years ago, experts felt, well, this wasn't a writing system, but rather decorations. And then they slowly realized that these were not letters nor words, but syllables. And it was really not well deciphered until the 1980s. And the breakthrough came in the 1980s by the 15-year-old son of a University of Texas in Austin professor. This professor, like most archaeologists, would travel off in the summer to do research. So every summer, this professor went down to the Mayan region in southern Mexico and Central America to study the monuments, and dragged along his 15-year-old son, who had at first resisted when he was younger, but then, he was in the middle of the jungle. Obviously, he couldn't use any of his electronic devices. There weren't many in the 1980s. So he became fascinated by these symbols, and he watched his father drawing them, so he took up drawing them, and he overheard his father talking with other experts trying to decipher them. And the 15-year-old son was 15 years old when he suddenly saw a pattern and told all the experts. And with that as the key, they quickly have been able to decipher only about 75% of the Mayan writings. Now, the Mayan civilization declined in the 19th century. It did not die out entirely, but the major population centers were depopulated. People moved in small villages in the countryside, and most specialists believe that the main reason for this environmental degradation, the main reason for this was environmental degradation. They had cut down so many trees that the soil was eroded in the heavy rains, and it was also coupled with, it was drought at the time and some war among the city-states, but there was no major external enemy came in. So where we are now, as the experts agree, it's environmental degradation. Chichen Itza is one of the major city-states in the northern part of the Yucatan. You'll recall on the map, it's very close to Cancun. Actually, it's about 2 or 3 hours on the highway, but it's very, very popular with tourists. This is the site as it exists today. This is the main pyramid. When it was first discovered by archaeologists about 150 years ago, it was overgrown with small bushes and trees. Those have been removed. And around this, there's an entire complex. It's fascinating, again, if you're ever in that part of Mexico, to go and spend at least one day there. You can see an observatory. You can see a Mayan ball court where they played something similar to basketball by hitting a hard rubber ball with their hips. That was the only way to hit it. And you'd score by somehow hitting it up in a hoop in the air. The catch was the losing team was sacrificed to the gods at the top of this altar. So this is Chichen Itza. Also, another major site was Calakmul. This is what it looks like today. It was totally overgrown with vegetation, but then to allow access, it was removed from one side where archaeologists have gone up, and as a tourist you can go up also. As you look on the horizon, you can see the many, many trees in this area, and aerial surveys in recent years have used a new type of radar that penetrates through the trees and into the ground somewhat, and have come up with maps showing literally hundreds and hundreds of similar temples to this, and raised walkways connecting all of the temple complexes and city-states. They're raised walkways, raised 4 or 5 feet above normal ground level. so people could still walk on them during heavy rains. Now, the Popul Vuh, which means which is the founding story or the creation story of the Incas. And we're going to spend a little time on this. There is an excellent video you need to watch that explains the Popol Vuh, and I'll give you an outline of it here. This is one of the few existing originals in the world, and because when the Spanish arrived, they burned as many of these as they could find because they thought that these were clearly non-Christian and they didn't really understand them. And so they would burn them so the people, the Mayans, could focus on learning Christianity. This is written on a type of paper, but it's not bound in a book, so it's called a codex, C-O-D-E-X, and it opens, and it's folded so it opens like an accordion. The Popol Vuh is the creation story of the Mayas, and it was passed down orally for many, many years until it was written. And it's a creation story that the Mayas believe tells how they, as Mayan people, were created. Now, virtually every society that we know of has some sort of creation story of the society. Look in the Bible, the book of Genesis, in the Judeo-Christian tradition. People believe that God created the earth. Why? Why would God create the earth? Think of yourself as being a god. Why would you create the earth? And why would you create people? If you are a god, by definition, you can do anything. You can snap your fingers. You get everything. Well, in the Bible, book of Genesis said God created the earth and then created people to take care of the earth. In essence, created people as gardeners, if you will, to take care of God's creation, the earth. This aspect of the Christian and Jewish creation story was widely used in the 1960s and 1970s when the environmental movement became much more active in the United States and Europe, saying that people had a biblical injunction to take care of the world. The Greeks, as we saw, had the Iliad and Odyssey to explain their foundation as a country, as a people. The Romans similarly had the Aeneid. Then if we look at a political entity, such as the United States as a country, well, Americans have long looked back at the so-called founding fathers, those who wrote the Declaration of Independence, like George Washington, fought against the British for independence, and then, of course, the drafting in subsequent years of the Constitution. And you can see the most important documents in the National Archives in Washington, D.C., the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, the very original ones are there, and they are preserved under bullet and bomb-proof glass. And in the summer, the height of tourist season, the line lasts 2 or 3 blocks for people who want to see the founding document. Now, the Popol Vuh was an ancient epic. It was not written down that we know of until after the Spanish conquest. Rather, it was passed from generation to generation orally. And this is much as you recall, like the Greek Iliad and the Odyssey. It was only written after the Spanish conquest. It's estimated around 1554, 1558. And it was written in the local Indian language, but also by some Indians, by Indians who could read the Mayan language. But then in the 1700s, a Spanish priest who had been studying the local Indian languages was able to translate it into Spanish. Now, according to the Popol Vuh, the gods created the Mayans on a very exact date. You don't need to know this date, but it's August 11th, 3014 BCE. The Popol Vuh is a very long, complicated story, and the essence of it is the gods created the earth, and then they wanted to create creatures who could praise them, the gods. So this was a four-step process. First, they created animals, but the animals couldn't speak. They could just squawk or roar or make noises. So the gods banished them off into the countryside and created people in the form of mud. They made them out of mud, but the problem with these people is they melted with the first rain. Then they created wooden people, but they had really no feelings. So while they could speak and they could praise the gods, they didn't really feel that. And so the gods were upset with the wooden people, created a huge flood, and the gods allowed a few survivors who transformed into monkeys. The gods transformed them into monkeys. And that would be a reminder to humans that what happens to people with no feelings when they're praising God. And finally, in the fourth and final step of this process, the gods created humans with hearts, with minds, who could praise the gods. And these are, according to the Popol Vuh, the Mayans. And the Popol Vuh required, and the gods required the Mayans, as a perfection of creation, to praise the gods, but they had to praise them according to the dates on the sacred calendar. And this is, of course, is the major reason the Mayans focused on astronomical observations, and the making of a detailed and very accurate calendar was so that they could create a calendar to praise the gods at the correct time. Now, the story itself is very long and complicated, and the video will give you the highlights. Essentially, there were two hero twins. These are humans who kill a macaw, which is a tropical bird. And then the two hero twins have a whole series of battles with the gods of the underworld. And finally, they win and prevail and start the Mayan civilization. This is very similar to the Aztec creation story, in which God does not create the Mayans or the Aztecs as a single event, but rather a series of trials and errors. And, so he had the mud people and the animals and the wooden people and then the Mayas. Now, the heroes of the Popol Vuh can be clearly seen on Mayan pottery going all the way back to 200 BCE throughout the Mayan culture, but well beyond the end of the Mayan city-states in around 900 CE. And in fact, current Mayan art often depicts series of events in the Popol Vuh, particularly the hero twins in their many, many battles. Now, as I mentioned before, the Mayans were the major civilization, decreased significantly around 900, but many Mayans continued to live in small villages. When the Spanish arrived in the 1500s, the Spanish soldiers did their best to subdue the Mayas. They had great resistance, and obviously they finally did. Today, Guatemala remains the center of the Mayan culture. Many students, perhaps some of you, families come from Guatemala, and I've had many students who actually, they or their parents speak some Mayan. The current country of Guatemala is approximately 80% of Mayan origin today, and also many Mayan descendants, millions of them, live in the southern highlands of Mexico. This is the state of Chiapas. Many of the Mayan traditions survive. For instance, the looms that women use when they're weaving, the clothing women wear, They have sort of a priest, a daykeeper who does offerings and prayers of the 260-day spiritual year. And Mayans consider their beliefs compatible with Christianity, which is an important point because when the Spanish invaded, they wanted to convert the Indians, and the Mayans said that they could accept Christianity, and the Spanish priests and monks said that's okay as long as you become Christians. This is an example of a Mayan woman today using the so-called back loom. As you can see, she's weaving, and the end of the loom is attached to her back, and with that she can move the pressure on the loom. About 10 years ago, I was in the Mayan area in southern Mexico in the state of Chiapas, and this is Chamula. And here you can see a Roman Catholic church that was built by the Spanish in the 1500s. It looks like a standard church from the outside. In fact, in the center of the plaza, there's a Christian cross, and it looks like a standard church. Now, you could only go into this church with a local guide. There weren't bus loads of tourists arriving. And this is a very isolated part of Mexico also. So this is the view. There were 4 or 5 of us who went with in a small van with an Indian guide. And the next slide has the interior of the church. Now, this does not look like the interior of a typical church in the United States. You have the church building. You have the people of Mayan descent sitting on the ground on straw, and they have candles burning. Now, this church is still in use, and every Sunday a Catholic priest from another town goes there to say the Catholic Mass. But they allow the people to continue with many of their indigenous religious practices. This is what I found most fascinating. This is a photo of people sitting on the floor. They have straw and they have candles. You can see on the upper left a man holding a chicken or a rooster, and he's going to cut the throat and spill the blood as an offering. In the center of the photo, you can see also 5 eggs. Those were given as offerings to the god. This is in a Catholic church. And then you can see next to it bottles of Coca-Cola and Pepsi. And you may wonder why there are bottles of Coca-Cola and Pepsi there. Well, our local guide, who was Mayan, calmly explained, well, that's because the people believed that if they drank those carbonated beverages very quickly and burped, that burp would drive the evil spirits from their bodies. And obviously this is not a traditional Mayan belief that goes back 1,000 years because they didn't have carbonated beverages then. But what this was a result of an enterprising Coca-Cola distributor in southern Mexico wanting to increase the market for Coca-Cola. So he convinced the fairly poor people that by burping after drinking Coca-Cola, they could expel the evil spirits. The Spanish or current Mexican priests just sort of laughed but allowed the practice to continue. You also see a bottle of Pepsi. Well, of course, Coke and Pepsi all over the world are engaged in a battle. Both are sort of carbonated cola drinks, and the Pepsi distributors jumped in and said, well, Pepsi's as good or better than Coca-Cola. So you can see both of those. Here's an advertisement for Coca-Cola in that part of Mexico. And this advertisement's like 30 years old, but it says in Spanish like, energize yourself. And you have a woman who supposedly is a Mayan woman. Well, you look at her face, she's clearly not a Mayan woman. She's, in fact, a famous Mexico City actress from the 1960s. Um, and, she's drinking a bottle of Coca Cola still in a plastic bottle. But this is part of the marketing campaign to this very day in the Mayan areas in southern Mexico and Central America. And our final slide, I took this photo outside that church on the side. And here we have a Mayan woman, and she's selling hand-woven textiles. And in the foreground, you can see she's selling various fruits. And then she has cases of Coca-Cola. Well, these cases of Coca-Cola are not sold just as a normal beverage, but the vast majority of the people, you could see them buying many bottles and going right into church. Okay, thank you very much.